the karma of the wealthy landowner, a haunting fate. In a remote village, Mr. Tham, a cruel, unwealthy landowner, controls the people through fear and oppression. His riches are believed to come from a hidden fortune passed down by his ancestors. However, Mr. Tham's brutality extends beyond financial exploitation. He even kills a young scholar who dares to love his daughter, leading to a series of tragedies. Soon after, Mr. Tham and his family are found dead in their home under mysterious circumstances, their deaths seen as divine retribution for their misdeeds. Years later, two local thieves, Teal and Balk, attempt to rob the abandoned house. Drawn by rumors of hidden gold, they break in under the cover of night. But the house is haunted by vengeful spirits, those of the scholar and Mr. Tham's daughter, who punish anyone who dares disturb their resting place. The thieves' greed leads them into a terrifying encounter with these spirits, and in their frantic escape, they suffer horrifying fates. The village, already filled with fear, becomes even more superstitious as tales of the haunted house grow. Part 1. The Legend of the Tham Mansion. The Tham Mansion loomed on the outskirts of the village like a decaying monument to greed and fear. Its once grand architecture, now cloaked in a tangle of vines and shadow, seemed to sag under the weight of time and sinister secrets. To the villagers, the mansion was cursed. No one dared approach it after dark. Some even avoided it during the day, crossing themselves when it came into view, heads bowed as if to ward off the evil that festered within. The tales of death and despair that lingered in its halls had seeped into the bones of the village, weaving themselves into every whispered conversation and cautious glance. No one had stepped foot inside for years. The mansion had belonged to Mr. Tham, a man known for his wealth, cruelty, and iron grip over the village. His riches seemed limitless. His estate sprawled far beyond the village's borders, filled with fields, orchards, and countless servants who lived in fear of his wrath. But what made Mr. Tham truly feared was the shadow that followed him. He was not just wealthy, he was brutal, unrelenting, and without mercy. If anyone dared to cross him, they would face a punishment so severe that even whispers of it caused a chill to sweep through the village. But then, as if the heavens had finally grown tired of his cruelty, the Tham family was wiped out in one night, a night so drenched in mystery that it quickly became legend. Some said Mr. Tham had been murdered in his sleep by his own servants, desperate to escape his grasp. Others believed it was the spirits of those he had wronged who had come to collect their due. No one knew for sure, and no one wanted to find out. The Tham mansion, once filled with lavish parties, golden chandeliers, and decadent feasts, was now a desolate, crumbling tomb. The villagers spoke of strange lights in the windows. Ghostly figures glimpsed through the overgrown gardens, and eerie cries echoing through the night. Some swore they had seen the spectre of Mr. Tham himself pacing the halls in eternal torment, while others claimed the mansion had become a prison for the souls of the innocent, those who had suffered under his tyranny. Yet, amidst the fear and superstition, there were whispers of something else, something that tugged at the darker side of human nature treasure. It was said that Mr. Tham, paranoid and obsessed with protecting his wealth, had hidden a fortune within the mansion's walls. Gold, jewels, and priceless artifacts, all locked away in secret rooms and underground chambers. But it was a rumor that had spread like wildfire among those desperate enough to listen, and it didn't take long for it to catch the ear of two notorious thieves, Teal and Bark. Teal and Bark were not like the villagers. Fear, to them, was merely an obstacle, a minor inconvenience when faced with the promise of riches beyond their wildest dreams. They had heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but unlike the superstitious villagers, they saw the mansion not as a cursed place but as an opportunity. An opportunity to strike it rich. The two men had worked together for years, carving out a reputation for being both ruthless and efficient. Teal, lean and sharp as a knife, was the mastermind. He had an eye for detail and a nose for trouble, always able to sense where the biggest score lay hidden. Bulk, on the other hand, was all brute strength. A mountain of a man with arms thick as tree trunks. He was the muscle behind their operations, always ready to break down doors, silence anyone who got in their way, and carry out whatever Theo asked of him. Together, they were a fearsome duo, feared in the underbelly of the region for their daring robberies. Theo's eyes had lit up the moment he heard the rumors of the Tham fortune. The village was remote, the mansion abandoned. The villagers were terrified, too scared to even walk past the place, let alone step foot inside. That meant the treasure, if it existed, had been sitting there for years untouched. It was perfect. A score like this could set them up for life, Theo thought. No more scraping by with petty thefts. No more running from the law or living in squalor. This was their ticket out. But Bulk was not so easily convinced. Despite his rough exterior and the countless jobs they pulled off together, there was something about the Tham mansion that unsettled him. "I don't like it," he muttered one night as they sat in the corner of a dingy tavern, the light of the candle between them flickering like a dying heartbeat. His voice was low, cautious. "That place, it's cursed, Theo. Everyone knows it, nobody's been in there in years. They say the ghosts of the Tham family still roam those halls, looking for revenge." Theo chuckled, swirling the dregs of his ale in his cup. "Ghosts? You believe in ghosts now, Bulk? Since when did a few old wives' tales scare you off?" Bulk shifted uneasily in his seat, his massive hands clenched into fists. "I don't believe in ghosts," he growled, though his tone was uncertain. "But something's not right about that place. People disappear around it. There's things people say they've seen. I don't like it." Theo leaned forward, his eyes glinting with excitement. "And what do people say about the treasure, huh? Gold, Bulk, more than we've ever seen in our lives. Just waiting for us. You think I'm going to let a few spooky stories scare me off? Think of it, the two of us, rich beyond our wildest dreams. We could get out of this miserable life, go anywhere." "Do anything?" Bulk hesitated, his mind torn between the gnawing fear in his gut and the image of piles of gold glittering in the darkness. He knew Theo well enough to know that once he set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. And Bulk had never been one to back down from a challenge, even when it sent shivers down his spine. With a deep breath, he nodded slowly. "Fine," he muttered, though the unease still lingered in his voice. "We'll do it. But if something goes wrong in there, Theo, we leave." No hesitation, Theo grinned, slapping Bulk on the shoulder. "Nothing's going to go wrong, my friend. We're going to walk out there with more gold than we've ever seen. You'll see." And so the plan was set. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Theo and Bulk made their way through the quiet village, heading for the mansion. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, as if the very earth around the mansion had rotted. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The village slept soundly, oblivious to the dangerous game Theo and Bulk were about to play. As they approached the mansion, Bulk's unease grew. The closer they got, the more he could feel it, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to weigh down on them, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He glanced at Theo, but his partner showed no signs of hesitation, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the mansion ahead. The gate stood ajar, creaking softly in the wind, as if beckoning them inside. The mansion loomed over them, its windows like empty eyes, dark and hollow. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw, waiting to swallow them whole. "Let's get this over with," Bulk muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Theo nodded, his grin never faltering. Together they stepped through the gate and into the shadow of the Tham mansion, unaware of the horrors that awaited them inside. As they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to shift around them, growing colder, heavier. The mansion's secrets, long buried, were about to be unearthed, and neither Theo nor Bulk would leave unscathed. The legend of the Tham mansion was far from over. Part 2. The plan to steal the treasure. The night was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was the kind of night that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. The village lay in a deep, unsettling stillness, as if it knew that something wicked was about to stir in the shadows. Yet, amidst the unnatural quiet, two figures moved with purpose, their faces hardened by greed and ambition. Theo led the way, his steps quick and confident, barely making a sound as he maneuvered through the narrow alleyways. His lean frame was almost invisible in the dim light, his black cloak blending into the night. Behind him, Bob lumbered reluctantly, his broad shoulders hunched as though he was trying to disappear into himself. His footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, each one echoing slightly louder than the last, and each one filled with hesitation. "Theo, I've been thinking," Bulk's voice came out in a hushed whisper, as if he were afraid of disturbing the stillness around them. His eyes darted nervously toward the edge of the village, where the silhouette of the Tham mansion loomed, dark and foreboding against the starless sky. "Maybe we should reconsider this. That place. It's not like any other job we've pulled." Theo didn't stop, didn't even turn around. "Reconsider," he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Since when did you become so soft, Bulk? We've done this 100 times. In and out, like ghosts ourselves. No one will ever know we were there but the stories." Theo Bulk pressed, his voice wavering slightly. "The villagers. They say no one who goes near the mansion at night ever comes back. It's cursed. The Tham family, there's something unnatural about their deaths." Theo finally slowed his pace and glanced over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight. "You're not scared of a few old ghost stories, are you, Bulk? Come on. That mansion is filled with treasure just waiting for us to take it. Gold, jewels, things worth more than you can imagine." He smirked, his voice lowering into a whisper, as if tempting Bulk with his words. "We'll never have to work again. One last job, and we're set for life." Bulk shifted uncomfortably, his large hands flexing nervously at his sides. He was a man of brute strength, accustomed to dealing with problems head-on, but something about the Tham mansion gnawed at him. It was as if the very idea of stepping foot on that cursed ground sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard too many tales, too many warnings, but Theo was fearless, or maybe just too greedy to care. Theo Bulk tried again, his voice thick with unease. "What if the stories are true? What if—" Theo cut him off with a sharp laugh, turning to face his partner fully now, his expression one of cold amusement. "The stories," he mocked. "You think the Thams are sitting around as ghosts, guarding their precious treasure? Listen to yourself, Bulk. Those stories were made up to scare people like us away, to keep the mansion untouched. And it's worked for years. No one's had the guts to go near it. But we're smarter than that. Aren't we?" Bulk opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Deep down, he knew Theo was right about one thing: no one had dared approach the Tham mansion in years. If there really was treasure hidden inside, it had been sitting there, untouched, gathering dust. It could all be theirs. Theo must have sensed Bulk's hesitation cracking, because his smirk widened. "Look, Bulk," he said, his tone softening as he stepped closer. "I've never led us wrong before, have I? We've pulled off jobs tougher than this, more dangerous than this. This mansion is just an old, crumbling house. No ghosts, no curses, just a pile of gold waiting for us to find it. Trust me. One night's work and we'll be rich." Bulk swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to believe Theo, wanted to think that it was just another job, just another house. But something still felt off. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to abandon this plan before it was too late. Yet, as he looked into Theo's gleaming eyes, filled with the promise of wealth and escape from the miserable life they had been living, he felt his resolve weaken. "All right," Bulk muttered, nodding slowly. "We do this. But if anything feels wrong, anything, we leave. No hesitation." "Got it?" Theo grinned, clapping Bulk on the back. "Of course. Nothing's going to go wrong. We'll be in and out before anyone notices." And with that, their plan was set. Theo's confidence never wavered, and soon enough they found themselves standing at the edge of the village, staring down the overgrown path that led to the Tham mansion. The night seemed darker here, the trees thicker, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers overhead. The air was colder, too, and for a moment Bach could have sworn he heard a faint whisper on the wind, something soft and mournful, like a distant cry for help. But he shook his head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread that crawled up his spine. It was just the wind, he told himself. Just the wind. The mansion came into view as they rounded a corner, and Bach's breath hitched in his throat. It was larger than he remembered from the stories, its towering silhouette almost blending into the night sky. The windows, dark and lifeless, stared back at them like hollow eyes, and the front gate, old and rusted, stood slightly ajar, creaking ever so slightly in the breeze. Theo moved toward it without hesitation, pushing the gate open with a low groan. Bob followed reluctantly, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the very walls of the mansion were aware of their presence. As they stepped onto the mansion grounds, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and the sounds of the village behind them faded into a suffocating silence. Even the wind, which had been rustling the trees moments before, seemed to die, leaving nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. Bog stopped, his eyes scanning the darkened windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at him from the gloom. But there was nothing, just the overgrown gardens, the crumbling stone steps, and the gaping maw of the front door, wide open as if waiting for them. Theo Bog whispered, his voice barely audible over the thudding of his heart. "Maybe we should know turning back now," Bog Theo interrupted, his voice steady and assured. "We're already here. You didn't come all this way to chicken out, did you?" Bog clenched his fists, fighting back his fear. He had come this far. There was no sense in stopping now. With a deep breath, he nodded and followed Tayo up the steps and through the front door. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply. The air inside the mansion was thick with dust and the stench of rot. Every breath felt like inhaling the past decay, abandonment, and something else. Something darker that clung to the walls like a stain that couldn't be washed away. Theo raised his lantern, casting a weak light into the foyer. The grand staircase, that once must have been a marvel of craftsmanship, was now a decrepit skeleton of its former glory, its banisters warped and broken. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floor beneath their feet creaked ominously with each step. "This place hasn't seen life in years," Tayo murmured, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "No one's been here since the Tams died. The treasure's got to be here somewhere." Bok said nothing, his gaze fixed on the shadows that seemed to flicker just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. There was a weight to the silence in the mansion, as if the very air was waiting for something, holding its breath in anticipation. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run before something terrible happened, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Tayo moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of hidden passages or concealed doors. "They say the treasure's in the basement," he said, more to himself than to Bok. "Come on, we'll find it." Bok hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, glancing back at the front door. The temptation to turn and leave was almost overwhelming, but Tayo's voice called him back, pulling him deeper into the mansion's cold embrace. They descended the staircase slowly, the wood groaning under their weight. Each step echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off the walls and fading into the distance. The darkness seemed to thicken around them, closing in like a living thing, pressing against their skin, suffocating. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, a door loomed before them, heavy and ancient, its surface etched with strange, faded symbols. Tayo's grin widened as he reached for the handle. "This is it," he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. The treasures behind this door box swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sand. He could feel it, the wrongness in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. But it was too late to turn back now. Part 3. Entering the haunted mansion. The old mansion loomed over Tayo and Bog, a monolith of rot and ruin, its twisted architecture seeming to defy the passage of time. The crumbling stone walls and overgrown ivy formed the fortress of decay, long abandoned but not forgotten. The very air around it seemed to hum with an eerie energy, as though the land itself remembered the cruelty of its former master. Theo and Bulk stood at the foot of the crumbling stone steps, staring up at the once grand entrance. The night was suffocating, heavy with the silence of things that lurked just beyond the light. Bulk's heart hammered in his chest, an invisible weight pressing down on him as he stared at the yawning doorway ahead, which seemed to beckon them into the darkness beyond. Theo, ever the fearless leader, pressed forward without hesitation, his lantern casting a weak, flickering light over the moss-covered stone steps. He glanced back at Bulk, his face half hidden in shadow, his grin wide and confident. "Come on, Bulk. Don't tell me you're scared of a little dust and cobwebs." Bulk grunted, forcing his legs to move as he followed Theo up the steps. The wooden door creaked open with a low groan, a sound that echoed through the still night like a warning. A chill rolled over Bulk as they stepped inside the mansion, the air colder and more oppressive than it had been outside. The foyer was a cavernous space, once grand and regal, now a shell of its former glory. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the walls were lined with faded portraits of long-dead faces staring down at them, their expressions hauntingly blank. Dust floated in the beams of light from Theo's lantern, the only movement in the stillness of the house. "This place is a tomb," Bob muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the creaks and groans of the old mansion. His unease gnawed at him, growing with every step they took. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen and malevolent lurking in the dark corners of the house. Theo, on the other hand, seemed completely unaffected. He moved with purpose, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he scanned the room. "It's perfect," he whispered, his voice filled with a greedy thrill. "No one's touched this place in years. We're going to be rich, Bulk." Just wait as they moved deeper into the mansion. The temperature seemed to drop even further. The walls, once painted with vibrant colors, were now peeling, the paint cracked and flaking like dead skin. The wooden banister of the grand staircase was splintered and broken, and the chandelier that once hung from the ceiling now lay shattered on the floor, its crystals scattered like the bones of some long-dead beast. Bulk's eyes darted around the room, his body tense with anticipation. He could feel it, the weight of the house pressing down on him, as if the very walls were alive, watching, waiting. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he followed Theo through the twisting hallways, each step growing heavier, each shadow darker. Theo, Bulk whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "Something's not right here. I can feel it. This place, it feels wrong." Theo didn't stop, didn't even look back. "You're imagining things," he said, his voice calm and dismissive. "It's just an old house, probably full of rats and mold. Nothing to be afraid of," but Bulk couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The deeper they went into the mansion, the more oppressive the air became. It felt thick, almost tangible, like walking through a dark fog. The shadows seemed to shift around them, flickering at the edges of his vision, and every now and then he thought he heard something soft whispers carried on the wind, or the faint creak of footsteps behind them. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone or something following them, but there was nothing, just the empty halls filled with the echoes of their footsteps and the distant groaning of the mansion's old, decaying bones. As they reached the end of the hallway, they came upon a set of large, double doors. The wood was ancient, dark with age, and etched with strange, intricate carvings. Bulk's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the doors, a sense of dread washing over him. He didn't know why, but something about those doors filled him with an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Theo, however, was undeterred. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the brass handle. "This has to be it," he muttered, more to himself than to Bulk. "This is where they kept the treasure. I can't feel it." Bulk swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Theo, maybe we should leave. We don't even know if the treasure's really here. What if before Bulk could finish, Tyle twisted the handle and pushed the doors open with a loud creak. A blast of cold air rushed out, as if the room had been sealed for centuries, trapping the chill inside. The light from Tyle's lantern flickered wildly for a moment, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Beyond the doors was a grand ballroom, or what had once been a grand ballroom. Now it was a ghost of its former self, the once polished floors covered in dust and debris, the high ceiling lined with cobwebs. Tall windows covered in grime lined the far wall, and in the center of the room stood a massive, decaying grand piano, its keys yellowed and cracked with age. Bulk hesitated at the threshold, his feet rooted to the spot. He didn't want to go in, didn't want to step any further into the belly of the beast. The air in the room felt wrong, thick with something unseen but undeniably there. It was like stepping into the heart of a graveyard, the air heavy with the weight of death and despair. Theo Bulk's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear. "I don't think we should be here." Tayo ignored him, stepping into the room with an eager grin on his face. He moved toward the grand piano, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the treasure. "This has to be it," he muttered. The Thams were known for their extravagant parties. They must have hidden their wealth in this room. There's no way they would leave it unguarded. Bulk's heart raced as he took a hesitant step into the ballroom, his skin crawling with unease. The air was colder here, and the silence was suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud and frantic, as if his body was trying to warn him that something was terribly, terribly wrong. As Theo circled the grand piano, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows across the room, Bulk's gaze was drawn to the far corner of the ballroom. There, hidden in the shadows, was a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was cracked and dirty, but something about it made Bulk's skin prickle with unease. Theo Bulk said, his voice trembling as he pointed toward the mirror. "Look at that." Theo glanced up, his eyes following Bulk's outstretched hand. He frowned as he saw the mirror, tilting his head as if trying to make sense of its presence. "A mirror," he scoffed. "That's what you're worried about? It's probably just some old decoration." Bulk swallowed hard, his throat tightening with fear. "I don't like it," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It doesn't belong here." Theo rolled his eyes, stepping toward the mirror with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's just a mirror." Bulk. "Stop being such a coward." But as Theo drew closer to the mirror, something strange happened. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, more oppressive. The light from Tayo's lantern flickered wildly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, Bulk saw something that made his blood run cold. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a figure standing just behind Theo. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light. Bulk's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. "Theo," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "Theo, there's someone behind you." Theo froze, his hand hovering just inches from the mirror. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. He frowned, turning back to the mirror. "What are you talking about, Bulk? There's no one." But before Tayo could finish, the figure in the mirror moved. Its hand shot out from the darkness, reaching for Tayo with long, twisted fingers. Bulk screamed, his body paralyzed with fear, as he watched the figure in the mirror wrap its hand around Tayo's shoulder. But when Tayo turned to face it, there was nothing but the cold, empty air. Theo staggered back, his eyes wide with shock as he stumbled away from the mirror. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. He looked at Bulk, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Did you see that? Did you see it?" Bulk nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He had seen it. He had seen something reach out for Tayo, something that shouldn't have been there. Part 4. Discovering the Cellar. The weight of silence pressed against them as Theo and Bulk stood before the entrance to the cellar, a gaping hole in the floor of the mansion. The dark, jagged staircase descended into what felt like the belly of a beast. The lantern in Teo's hand flickered as a draft of cold air escaped from below, carrying with it a stench so foul that Bulk had to clamp a hand over his mouth. It was the smell of raw thick, choking, and sickly sweet. Teo grinned, the greed in his eyes brighter than the light in his lantern. "This is it," he whispered, his voice full of excitement, oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere around them. "The treasure's down there, I can feel it. We're close, Bulk." So close that Bulk, on the other hand, was not so sure. His gut screamed at him to turn back, to leave this cursed place before something unspeakable happened. But Teo's hunger for wealth was infectious, and the idea of gold, real, glimmering gold, was enough to keep Bulk's feet moving, even as every fiber of his being screamed to run. Teo began to descend the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking under his weight. Each step sent a dull thud echoing through the hollow space below, the sound bouncing back at them from the depths. Bulk followed, his heart hammering in his chest, his legs feeling as though they were made of lead. The dampness clung to them, making the steps slick and treacherous, as though the very air was alive and trying to push them back. The further they descended, the colder it became. The light from the lantern seemed to shrink, the flame dancing erratically, as if threatened by an unseen force. Shadows flickered on the stone walls, their twisted forms moving like spectres in the periphery of Bulk's vision. He kept his eyes focused on Teo, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him. "This place is cursed," Bulk muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "We shouldn't be here, Teo." Teo didn't respond. His gaze was fixed ahead, his breath quickening with anticipation. They had reached the bottom of the stairs now, and before them stretched the cellar, a vast, empty space that seemed to swallow the weak light of the lantern. The stone floor was slick with moisture, and the walls were covered in dark, creeping mold. Every breath tasted of decay. Bulk's stomach turned as he scanned the room, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. There was something wrong here, something profoundly unnatural about this place. It was as though the very air was filled with malevolence, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting. Suddenly the lantern's light caught something faint but unmistakable. A gleam of gold, far at the back of the room. It was almost imperceptible, but there it was, a faint sparkle, shimmering in the dim light. There Teo hissed, his voice trembling with excitement. "I told you, the treasure's real." Without waiting for a response, Teo moved forward, his boots squelching against the damp floor. Bulk hesitated, his gaze darting nervously around the room. The air felt heavier here, thick and suffocating. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to drag Teo out of this place before it was too late. But he couldn't. He followed, each step more reluctant than the last. As they approached the back of the cellar, the light from the lantern flickered again, and Bulk's eyes caught movement, something in the shadows swaying. He froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. "Teo," he whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" Teo paused, his hand hovering above a pile of debris, his eyes wide with anticipation. Hear what he muttered, his voice distracted, focused entirely on what he thought would be a heap of gold. Bulk strained his ears, listening. At first there was nothing but the soft drip of water from the ceiling. But then, faint and distant, came the sound, a slow, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under the weight of something heavy. It was the sound of something swaying back and forth, gently but unnervingly. There Bulk breathed, his eyes darting toward the darkest corner of the room. "There's something moving." Teo frowned, glancing over his shoulder. "Probably just the wind," he said, but even his voice had lost a little of its excitement. He stood up, scanning the room, the greed in his eyes momentarily replaced by caution. The creaking continued, slow and steady, like a pendulum swinging in the distance. Bulk felt his pulse quicken. There was no wind. The cellar was sealed tight. The only way in or out was the staircase they had descended. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't natural. "Let's get the treasure and go," Teo said, his voice strained. He turned back to the pile of debris. kneeling down and beginning to dig through it, his hands trembling with eagerness. The faint gleam of gold became more visible, buried beneath years of dust and rot. Bob couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His eyes kept darting back to that dark corner of the room, where the creaking seemed to grow louder, more insistent. He took a step toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he moved closer, the light from the lantern flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows on the wall. The creaking grew louder still, and now it was clear something was swaying in the darkness. Bob stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There, hanging from the ceiling, was a rope, and at the end of that rope, something moved. His blood ran cold as the lantern's light flickered again, and for a brief moment he saw it clearly, an old, rotting noose, swaying gently from side to side. Hanging from it was the twisted, decaying body of a man, his face bloated and blackened with death, his eyes wide and lifeless. Bob's scream caught in his throat, his legs buckling beneath him as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. "Theo," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Theo, we have to go, now." But Theo was too far gone, his hands greedily pulling at the pile of debris, the faint gleam of gold filling his vision. "Just a little more," he muttered, his voice frantic. "We're almost there." "Theo, listen to me." Bulk's voice trembled with fear, his heart pounding in his chest. "We have to leave. There's something down here, something dead." But Theo didn't respond. His fingers dug deeper into the pile, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was too close, too consumed by his greed to care about the horrors lurking in the dark. Bulk took another step back, his eyes locked on the hanging body, swaying gently in the cold, still air. The creaking of the rope was deafening now, each swing a grotesque reminder of the death that had claimed this place. He could feel it, something was watching them, something that did not belong in the world of the living. Suddenly, the rope snapped. With a sickening thud, the body dropped to the ground, the sound of its impact echoing through the cellar. Bulk froze, his breath caught in his throat, as the decaying figure lay motionless on the floor, its twisted limbs played out in unnatural angles. And then, slowly, horribly, it began to move. Bulk stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the corpse twitched, its bony fingers clawing at the damp stone floor. Its eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to focus on him, as though it were aware of his presence. Theo Bulk's voice was barely a whisper now, his body trembling with fear. "We have to go." But Theo was oblivious, his hands still digging through the pile of debris, his mind consumed by the thought of gold. He didn't see the horror unfolding behind him. With a sickening crack, the corpse's head twisted toward Bulk, its mouth opening in a silent scream. The stench of death filled the air, thick and suffocating. As the thing dragged itself closer, its body twitching and convulsing with every movement. Bulk's legs refused to move, his body frozen in terror as the corpse inched closer, its decaying fingers scraping against the floor. He could feel its presence, feel the cold, unnatural weight of death pressing down on him. Suddenly Theo let out a triumphant shout. "I found it," he cried, his voice filled with greedy joy. He held up a small golden coin, its surface gleaming in the lantern's flickering light. But Bulk couldn't tear his eyes away from the horror before him. "Theo," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please, we need to leave." Now Theo, still caught up in his discovery, didn't respond. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the treasure in his hands, oblivious to the danger closing in around them. The corpse let out a low, guttural moan, its voice a rasping whisper that echoed through the cellar. It was so close now, its foul breath chilling Bulk to the bone. In that moment, Bulk knew they were not leaving this place alive. Part 5. The Spirits of the Scholar and the Daughter. The oppressive darkness wrapped itself around Theo and Bulk like a living thing as they ventured deeper into the mansion. The air was thick with rot and decay, but something far more sinister seemed to linger, clinging to their skin and filling their lungs with dread. The light from their lantern flickered weakly, barely illuminating the walls that seemed to close in on them as they moved forward. In the oppressive silence, their footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, as if the mansion itself was amplifying every sound. Bulk's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart racing in his chest. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath, the words trembling on his lips. "Tio, let's go. Please, let's just leave." But Tayo's face was twisted with greed, his eyes gleaming with a wild determination that drowned out all fear. Levy scoffed, not even glancing back at his companion. "We've come too far to leave now. Do you know what kind of fortune could be waiting for us? We're going to be rich, Bok, rich." Bok swallowed hard, his throat dry. "There's something wrong with this place. I can feel it." His voice was barely a whisper, as if he were afraid something might hear him. He could sense it in the air, a heavy, unnatural presence that seemed to watch their every move. As they turned a corner, the faint outline of two figures began to materialize from the shadows at the far end of the room. Theo halted, squinting through the dim light, and Bulk felt his blood turn to ice. There, hanging from the rafters, were the bodies of a young man and a girl. Bulk's breath caught in his throat, his mind refusing to fully process what his eyes were seeing. The young man's body swayed ever so slightly, his arms limp at his sides, his face a mask of terror. His eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly at nothing, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Next to him, the girl's body hung limply, her head tilted forward, her long dark hair cascading down, hiding her face from view. Bulk took a step back, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Tayo, we need to go." Tio, however, seemed unfazed. He took a step closer to the bodies, tilting his head curiously as if studying them. "It's just a trick," he muttered, more to himself than to Bulk. "They're trying to scare us off." Bulk's eyes darted nervously around the room, expecting at any moment for the shadows to come alive, for the dead to move. He could feel the weight of their presence, their lifeless eyes boring into him, dragging his mind to the brink of madness. "This isn't a trick, Tayo," he pleaded, his voice growing more frantic. "We need to leave. There's something wrong here." But Tayo ignored him. He moved forward, the lantern's flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls as he approached the hanging bodies. "Look at them," Bob, Tayo said, his voice unnervingly calm. "They're just dolls. Whoever lived here probably set this up to scare away thieves like us." Bulk shook his head violently, his body trembling with fear. "No," he whispered. "No, they're not dolls. I can feel them. They're watching us." Tayo glanced back at him, his expression one of mild irritation. "You're imagining things. Stop being such a coward." Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, causing the lantern flame to flicker dangerously. The bodies swayed gently in the breeze, their movements slow and deliberate, as if responding to the unseen force that now filled the air. Bulk's breath hitched in his throat, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. The girl's hair shifted slightly with the movement, revealing a glimpse of pale, lifeless skin beneath. Bulk felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his vision swimming with terror. "We need to leave," he choked out, backing away toward the door. "Tayo, please." But Tayo was already moving toward the far wall, his eyes gleaming with that insatiable hunger for wealth. "This is all just a distraction," he muttered under his breath. "They're trying to scare us away from the treasure." Bulk could barely hear him over the pounding of his heart. His gaze flicked back to the bodies, dread gnawing at his insides like a wild animal. The young man's eyes seemed to fix on him now, empty but full of accusation. He had been wrong. Bulk could feel it. The air was thick with the weight of his death, with the injustice of whatever had happened here. Bulk could almost hear the young man's voice, a whisper in the back of his mind, urging him to leave before it was too late. But Theo was blind to it all. His greed had consumed him, made him deaf to the warnings that echoed through the very walls of the mansion. He moved toward the corner of the room where a heavy wooden chest lay half hidden beneath a pile of debris. Bog's eyes were drawn back to the girl, her face still obscured by her hair. He could feel her presence silent, sorrowful, and filled with anger. There was something wrong about the way she hung there, something that felt horribly wrong, as though she was not at peace. Then, without warning, her head twitched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but Bog saw it. He froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. His heart slammed against his ribcage as he watched, unable to look away. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the girl's head tilted up, her hair falling away from her face to reveal pale, decaying flesh and hollow, blackened eyes. Bog staggered backward, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "Theo," he cried out, his voice hoarse with panic. "Theo, they're real. They're not dolls," but Theo was too focused on the chest in front of him, oblivious to the horror unfolding behind him. He grunted with effort as he pried open the lid, his eyes widening at the sight of gold coins gleaming in the dim light. "I knew it," he breathed, his voice filled with triumph. "I told you, Bog, we're going to be rich." Bog barely heard him. His entire body was frozen in terror as the girl's body twitched again, her arms slowly beginning to move, as if she were waking from a long, terrible slumber. Her head lolled to the side, and her lifeless eyes seemed to focus on Bog, her mouth twitching as if she were trying to speak. "Theo, please," Bog whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to go. We need to leave this place before it's too late." But Theo wasn't listening. He was too busy scooping handfuls of gold coins into his pockets, his face twisted with greed. "Just a little more," he muttered to himself, his hands moving frantically. Where almost reached, the sound of creaking wood filled the air, and Bog's heart stopped. He turned, his breath catching in his throat, as the young man's body began to sway violently from side to side, as if some unseen force was pulling at the rope. His lifeless eyes were wide and filled with terror, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. Bog felt a scream building in his own throat, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed with fear, his legs refusing to move. The girl's body jerked again, her arms lifting slowly, as if reaching out toward him. Her head tilted back, her mouth opening in a soundless wail that filled the room with an unbearable sense of sorrow and rage. Suddenly the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Bog's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He could feel the presence of the dead all around him, closing in, suffocating him. He reached out blindly, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the door. "Theo," he screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "We have to go." No, but there was no answer. Part 6. The haunting begins. The darkness was absolute. The moment the lantern's flickering light died out, the oppressive blackness swallowed them whole, as though the house itself had been waiting, biding its time to finally spring its trap. For the first time since they had entered the mansion, Theo faltered, standing motionless in the suffocating void. His breath hitched, his chest tightening as the air around them grew impossibly cold. Bog's heart pounded against his ribs, terror gripping him like a vice. The girl, he couldn't stop thinking about her, her face pale, hollow and soulless, her head snapping up, as if some unseen force had commanded her to move. And now the darkness was alive. He could feel it pressing in, suffocating him with a palpable malevolence. Theo Bog's voice was barely a whisper, strangled with fear. "Theo, where are you?" There was no response. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and unbearable, until suddenly he heard it, a faint creaking sound, like wood straining under pressure. It was coming from above them. Bog's breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Bog asked, his voice trembling. A moment of dreadful silence passed, but then came a chilling response: creak, creak. The slow, deliberate movement of something hanging, something shifting in the darkness. Theo's breath came in short, sharp gasps, his bravado from moments earlier evaporating as the sinister reality of their situation settled over him. He fumbled in the dark, searching for the lantern. His hand shook as he tried to reignite the flame, but his fingers felt clumsy, numb from the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. But before he could even attempt to relight it, something cold, impossibly cold, brushed against his ankle. Theo froze. His skin prickled with icy fear, and for the first time he was truly aware of the silence that surrounded them. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as though the entire world had gone still, holding its breath, waiting. Then another touch, this time firmer, unmistakably a hand, cold as death, gripping his leg. He yelped, jumping back, but his heel collided with something soft. He reached down, his hands trembling, to find that it wasn't the ground beneath him. His fingers brushed against long, wet strands of hair. Oh God! Bulk stumbled backward, tripping over debris in the pitch-black room. His eyes strained uselessly against the darkness, searching for Theo, but his mind was now lost to panic. Theo! Theo! He shouted, desperation rising in his voice. He could feel it, something was in the room with them. Something was moving. Suddenly the whispers began, low at first like the murmur of distant voices carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder, filling the room with their eerie cadence. It was as if the mansion itself had awoken, the walls alive with the voices of the dead. You, disturbed. Our rest of voices whispered, faint but unmistakable, coming from every direction at once. Bulk's skin crawled. What are they saying? He stammered, backing into a corner. His entire body shook with uncontrollable terror. Theo, still scrambling on the ground, ignored the whispers. It's not real, he muttered under his breath, trying to reassure himself as much as Bulk. It's just the wind, just our imagination, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The icy grip around his ankle was not imaginary. He could feel it tightening, dragging him down. Bulk let out a scream as something cold brushed against his neck. His eyes darted wildly around the room, though they saw nothing but inky blackness. Theo, we need to get out of here. His voice was shrill with terror now, cracking as panic overtook him. His body felt paralyzed, frozen in fear, as if some invisible force was keeping him rooted to the spot. And then he felt it too cold, bony fingers wrapping around his ankles, pulling, tugging, dragging him toward the center of the room. No, Bulk kicked wildly, trying to shake off whatever was holding him, but the grip was relentless. He could feel the hands tightening, pulling harder, and for a brief, horrifying moment he thought he heard the faintest of whispers right next to his ear, a cold breath against his skin. You shouldn't. I've come. A cry escaped Bulk's throat, and he thrashed wildly, his hands clawing at the floor as he tried to pull himself away from the unseen force dragging him into the darkness. His fingers scraped against the cold stone floor, nails breaking, but he could feel himself being pulled inexorably forward, inch by inch. Suddenly the sound of wood creaking again echoed through the room, louder this time. The bodies hanging above them were moving. Bulk could hear the rope straining as the corpses swayed, their feet brushing against the floor. A slow, deliberate swaying, as if something had reanimated them, pulling their lifeless forms toward the ground. Theo Bulk screamed again, his voice cracking with terror. The voices grew louder, their whispers turning into an eerie chant. You, disturbed, our rest, they intoned over and over, their words weaving together in a symphony of death. The cold hands continued to pull at their ankles, as though the spirits of the mansion were determined to drag them into the abyss. Theo, heart pounding in his chest, finally managed to relight the lantern. For a brief second, the flickering flame illuminated the room, and what they saw was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. The hanging bodies had come to life. The young man and the girl, their eyes hollow and black, were no longer suspended motionlessly from the rafters. They swayed gently, their bodies twitching with unnatural movements. The girl's head lolled to the side, her eyes locking onto Bulk with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. The lantern flickered again, the light dimming momentarily, and in that brief moment the girl's body jerked violently, her arm stretching out toward Bulk, her hand twisted into a claw-like grasp. A guttural, gurgling sound emanated from her throat, as though she was trying to speak, but the words were choked off, lost to the decay that had taken over her lifeless form. Theo stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That it's not real," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But the terror in his voice betrayed his lie. It was real, and he could feel it. The cold hands at his feet grew stronger, pulling him down to the floor. He fell, hitting the ground hard, and the lantern slipped from his grasp, clattering across the stone floor and casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The bodies swayed again, their movement unnatural and jerky, as if some unseen force was controlling them, dragging them down from the rafters. Bulk was screaming now, thrashing against the invisible hands that held him down. His mind was lost to panic, every nerve in his body on fire with terror. He clawed at the ground, his fingers digging into the cold stone, but it was no use. He was being pulled toward the center of the room, toward the bodies. "Theo, help me," he screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. "Help me, please," but Taya was paralyzed, staring in horror as the girl's body jerked again, her head snapping to the side with a sickening crack. Her hollow eyes bored into him, filled with an indescribable rage. Slowly her mouth opened, her jaw unhinged far wider than any human mouth should have been able to, and from her throat came a sound that was not of this world, a low, guttural growl, filled with anguish and fury. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the smell so overwhelming that Theo gagged, his stomach turning, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen, held in place by the cold grip of fear. The voices continued their chant, louder now, more insistent. "You disturbed dead. Our rest," they repeated over and over, their words growing more malevolent with each passing second. Bulk's screams grew more frantic as he felt the cold hands pulling him closer to the bodies. He kicked and flailed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the hands were relentless. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, drowning out everything but the sound of his own terror. And then, as if in response to the growing fear in the room, the mansion itself began to creak and groan, the walls shifting as though the house was alive, as though it too was feeding off their fear. The lantern flickered again, its light growing weaker, and in the dim glow, the hanging bodies moved once more. This time they came closer. Part 7. Terror and Panic. The cold enveloped the cellar like a living thing, creeping into every crevice and chilling the air to a deadly silence. The moment Tayo and Bulk were separated, a suffocating sense of dread descended upon them both. It was as though the mansion had decided to finally bare its teeth, releasing the spirits that had long slumbered beneath its rotting walls. The darkness was absolute, swallowing every ounce of light and sound, leaving only the rapid beating of their hearts and the distant, unnerving whispers of the dead. "Chio, Tayo, where are you?" Bulk's voice trembled through the pitch-black space, but it was faint, hollow, as though the darkness itself was swallowing the sound whole. Teal tried to respond, but his breath hitched in his throat, the cold air freezing his lungs. His voice came out in a strangled gasp, barely audible over the thundering silence. "Bulk, I'm here." His words felt like they dissolved into the void, swallowed before they even reached his lips. And then the real horror began. Out of the oppressive silence came a sensation so chilling, so unnatural, that it made every hair on Teo's body stand on end. Cold, bony fingers, icy and relentless, began to crawl up his legs. At first it was a faint touch, barely perceptible, but as the seconds ticked by, the pressure increased as though the hands were growing bolder, hungrier. Teo froze. His body refused to obey him, every muscle locked in place by an overwhelming wave of fear. The fingers, those cold, inhuman fingers, slithered up his body, tightening around his legs, then his waist, paralyzing him with a numbing terror. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind screamed for him to move, to escape, but his body had surrendered to the fear, as if the spirits themselves had taken control. In the distance, Bog's panicked voice echoed again, but this time it was different, more desperate, more terrified. "Theo, help me. Please God, help me." His screams were frantic, almost animalistic, as if he had glimpsed something in the darkness that no human should ever see. But the air seemed to choke the sound, dampening it into a muffled cry for help. Theo's heart hammered against his rib cage, threatening to burst from his chest. The cold fingers climbed higher, ghostly and unrelenting, until they reached his neck. His throat tightened, the pressure of unseen hands squeezing the very breath from his body. Panic surged through him like fire, but the icy grip only tightened, sending a freezing wave of paralysis through his veins. His eyes darted wildly in the dark, searching for any glimpse of light, any way to escape this living nightmare. The whispers began again, low and haunting, like the murmur of distant voices carried on a cold wind. But this time they were closer, much closer. "You, disturbed. Arrest," they hissed, the words slithering into Theo's ears like venom. "Shall not. Leave." The freezing air seemed to thicken around him, pressing in from all sides, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. The fingers around his neck tightened further, cutting off his air. His vision blurred as his body began to convulse, fighting for oxygen. But no matter how much he struggled, how much he tried to pry the invisible hands away, the grip only grew stronger. Theo tried to scream, but his voice was a mere rasp, strangled by the icy hands. His body was being dragged forward now, the cold pulling him closer to the center of the room, closer to the hanging bodies. He could feel them, he could feel the oppressive weight of their presence in the dark, their cold breath brushing against his skin. The air grew colder with every inch he was pulled, until it felt like ice was seeping into his bones. Somewhere in the dark, Bob was still screaming, but his voice was growing weaker, more distant, as though the mansion was consuming him, devouring him piece by piece. And then something far worse happened. From the corner of the room, a soft creaking sound filled the air. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew louder, closer. It was the sound of the rope straining, of the body swaying in the dark, moving ever so slightly with each pull of the invisible force. The creaking grew more insistent, more urgent, as though the spirits were growing restless, eager to make their move. Theo's blood ran cold. The hanging bodies, they were moving. He could feel it in his bones, the way the air shifted, the way the darkness seemed to throb with a new kind of malevolence. Suddenly a hand, no, not a hand, a claw latched onto Theo's ankle, its grip iron tight. He screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror as he was yanked off his feet, dragged across the cold stone floor. His fingernails scraped against the ground, desperately searching for something to hold on to, but the cellar offered no mercy. The cold fingers were everywhere now, pulling him, dragging him deeper into the darkness. Bog's screams grew more frantic, but Theo couldn't see him anymore. The darkness was too thick, too suffocating. He could only hear the panicked cries, the sound of his partner thrashing against the unseen forces. But even that began to fade, as if Bog was being dragged farther away, deeper into the void. Theo's body slammed against something hard, a wall, or maybe the floor, he couldn't tell. Pain exploded in his side, but the icy grip only tightened, dragging him toward the source of the whispers, toward the hanging bodies. The air was so cold now that Theo could see his breath, every exhale forming small clouds of mist that quickly dissolved into the darkness. His body shook uncontrollably, the cold seeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. His mind raced, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The spirits had them now, and they weren't going to let go. And then, through the darkness, Theo saw it. A pale face, hollow, empty eyes. The girl from before, her head hanging at an unnatural angle, her body swaying gently in the dark. Her lips moved, though no sound came out at first, only the faintest hiss of air escaping her lungs. But then she spoke. "Why are you?" Here her voice was cold, devoid of emotion, but it cut through the darkness like a knife, sending a wave of terror crashing over Teal. He tried to back away, but the cold fingers around his body held him in place, immobilizing him. The girl's head snapped upright, her eyes locking onto Teal with a gaze so intense it felt like she was peering directly into his soul. "You disturbed our rest," she whispered again, her voice growing louder, more insistent. The hanging bodies around her swayed in time with her words, their eyes wide and hollow, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. Teal's heart raced as the girl floated closer, her cold breath brushing against his skin. He could see her more clearly now, her once beautiful face now twisted with rage, her eyes burning with a hatred that had festered for years. Her hands, cold and skeletal, reached out toward him, her fingers brushing against his chest. "You will never leave," she hissed, her voice echoing through the cellar like a death sentence. Teal's body convulsed in terror, but there was no escape. The darkness had him now, and the spirits were hungry. The cold fingers tightened around his neck, squeezing the life from his body. His vision blurred, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he felt himself slipping away. And then, in the final moment of terror as the darkness closed in, the last thing Teal heard was the cold, ghostly whisper in his ear, "You will stay with us forever." Part 8. The Final Moments. The cold air in the cellar felt like it had thickened, pressing down on Teal, as though the very walls were closing in, suffocating him with each second. His breaths came in shallow gasps, more like a dying man's last desperate pulls for air than any real attempt to steady himself. He tried to move, to fight back against the unseen hands that held him in place, but his body refused to respond. His limbs were heavy, weighed down by an unnatural force, as if the spirits themselves had taken control of his very being. A cold whisper brushed against his ear, chilling him to the bone. "You will never leave." The voice was the girl's, but it sounded as though it came from everywhere at once, echoing off the damp, decaying walls of the cellar. It was soft, almost tender in its coldness, but beneath that whisper was an undercurrent of hatred and rage that sent a jolt of terror through Tayo's body. His mind screamed for escape, but there was none. The cellar was alive with the spirits of the mansion, and they were not going to let him go. He could feel them now. Their presence was no longer a vague sense of unease, but a tangible weight pressing on him from every side. They were all around him, watching, waiting, their hollow eyes burning into him from the shadows. Bulk screams echoed through the dark, but even they were beginning to fade, as if the mansion itself was swallowing his voice whole. "Teal, help me." Please, the words came out in ragged gasps, punctuated by sobs of pure terror, but they were growing fainter by the second. Teal strained to hear his partner, his heart pounding in his chest, but the cold fingers around his throat tightened, cutting off his breath. His vision blurred as the darkness closed in, the girl's face swimming before his eyes. Her hollow, empty eyes stared directly into his, piercing him with a look of unrelenting judgment. "You disturbed our rest," she whispered again, her voice so close that Tayo could feel the chill of her breath on his skin. "You will never escape." Teal's body convulsed in fear, his mind a chaotic storm of regret and panic. Why hadn't they listened to the villagers? Why had they been so greedy, so foolish as to enter this cursed place? But it was too late for those questions now. The mansion had them, and it wasn't letting go. From the corner of the room, Tayo could hear Bulk's frantic footsteps. His partner's heavy breathing filled the cellar as he stumbled in the dark, desperate for an escape. Teal Bulk's voice cracked with fear, his movements erratic as he blindly searched for a way out. But no matter how hard he tried, the darkness only grew thicker, as if the mansion itself was swallowing him whole. Then silence. For a moment, everything went still. Tayo could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, rapid and uneven in his chest. Bulk's voice had disappeared, swallowed by the oppressive silence that now filled the air. Teal's chest tightened, panic surging through him like a cold, icy wave. "Balk," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. The girl's face loomed closer, her cold, dead eyes locking onto his. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile as she leaned in, her whisper sending shivers down his spine. "Your friend is gone," she hissed. "And soon you will be too." Tayo's body trembled as the weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. He could feel his strength draining away, the cold seeping into his bones, making it impossible to move. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, for flight, but his limbs were frozen in place, as though the spirits had claimed them for their own. From the darkness, a low moan echoed through the cellar, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. The other spirits were closing in now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, their twisted forms swaying gently in the shadows. Teal's heart raced as the moaning grew louder, more urgent, filling the air with a bone-chilling sense of dread. He could feel them, their cold fingers brushing against his skin, their icy breath chilling him to the core. The spirits were all around him now, their presence suffocating, their whispers filling his ears with promises of eternal suffering. "Stay with us," they whispered, their voices blending into a haunting chorus that made Tayo's blood run cold. "Stay." Forever. Teal's vision swam as the girl's face drew even closer, her breath freezing against his skin. His body convulsed with fear, but there was nothing he could do. The mansion had taken everything from him, his strength, his will, his hope. He was trapped, just like the spirits who had come before him. And then, in the final moments, as the cold fingers tightened around his throat, Tayo realized the truth. The treasure, the wealth, the promise of fortune, it had all been a lie. A cruel, twisted trick to lure the greedy into the mansion's grasp. And now he and Bob would pay the price for their trespass. A scream tore from Teal's throat, but it was cut short as the cold fingers around his neck squeezed tighter, cutting off his air. His vision darkened, the cellar fading away into nothingness, as the girl's cold, dead eyes were the last thing he saw. "You will never leave," she whispered, her voice fading into the blackness. And then there was nothing. The mansion stood silent and still once more, the spirits having claimed yet another victim. The echoes of the thieves' screams faded into the walls, swallowed by the darkness that had consumed them both. In the village below, the people whispered of the cursed mansion, of the treasure that had lured many to their doom. But no one dared approach it, for they knew the truth: the Tham mansion was no place for the living. And as the wind howled through the empty halls, the spirits of Tayo and Bulk joined the others, their cold whispers forever haunting the place they had once sought to rob. Part 9. The village's new horror. The sun had barely crested over the horizon when the first whispers began to drift through the village like an ill wind. At first it was just a trickle, a few villagers claiming to have seen strange lights flickering in the windows of the long-abandoned Tham mansion the night before. Others swore they had heard low, guttural noises, like the groans of the dead, carried on the wind from the direction of the cursed estate. As dawn stretched its golden fingers across the land, the whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire. There back an old woman muttered to her neighbor, her voice shaky with age and fear. "The spirits of the Tham family have returned by mid-morning." The village square was buzzing with nervous energy. Everyone had heard the stories of the mansion, of the curse, of the countless souls who had entered and never returned. The Tham estate had long been a place of dread, a decaying monument to the greed and cruelty of its former owners. But for years it had been silent, dormant, until now. The village's elder, a man named Master Dan, stood at the center of the crowd, his weathered face grave. "It's true," he said, his voice cutting through the hushed conversations. "I saw it myself last night. There were lights in the mansion, flickering, unnatural, and the air, it felt wrong, cold, like the dead were walking among us." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd, and several people crossed themselves, murmuring prayers under their breath. No one wanted to admit it, but the fear in the air was palpable. Something had stirred in the Tham mansion, something that had no business in the world of the living. But it wasn't just the lights that had the villagers on edge. There had been other signs, strange, unnatural occurrences in the night. Animals had gone missing, their bodies found mutilated in the fields, their eyes wide with terror. The wind had howled through the village like a banshee's wail, rattling windows and doors, and more than one villager had awoken from nightmares drenched in cold sweat, convinced that something had been watching them from the shadows. "We need to go up there," a man from the back of the crowd said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to appear brave. "We need to see what's happening." A heavy silence fell over the group. No one wanted to be the one to go near the mansion. Everyone had heard the stories of the mansion's haunted past, and now, after what had happened to Tayo and Bulk, though no one had yet spoken it aloud, there was little doubt that something terrible had occurred within those crumbling walls. Still, a sense of duty, or perhaps curiosity, began to gnaw at the edges of the village's fear. A group of them, led by Master Dan, finally gathered the courage to make the trek up the hill to the Tham mansion. Armed with lanterns, torches, and old religious relics, they approached the estate as cautiously as one might approach a wild animal, unsure if it was sleeping or waiting to strike. As they neared the mansion, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. The wind, which had been a light breeze in the village below, seemed to twist and howl around them, carrying with it faint whispers that none of them could quite understand. The towering mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the morning sky, every window dark and foreboding, as though the house itself was watching them approach. The front door, hanging off its hinges and rotting with age, creaked ominously as Master Dan pushed it open. The group stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty foyer. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling around them in pale clouds as they ventured deeper into the mansion's decaying heart. The walls, once adorned with lavish tapestries and paintings, were now barren and cracked, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. The air was damp and oppressive, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay. Every step felt like a violation, as though the house was warning them to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But they pressed on, their lanterns casting long shadows as they made their way through the winding corridors, down the grand staircase and toward the cellar. It was there, at the bottom of the staircase, that they found Tayo and Bulk. The sight of the two thieves stopped the group in their tracks, their breaths catching in their throats as they took in the horrifying scene. Tayo and Bulk lay crumpled on the cold stone floor, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles, as though they had fallen from a great height. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, their eyes wide and bulging, mouths gaping in silent screams. Their hands were clawed, as if they had tried to fight something off in their final moments, but whatever it was had been too powerful, too terrible. Master Dan knelt beside the bodies, his face ashen. "They've been here all night," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Their bodies, they're cold, but their eyes, it's like they saw something we can't even imagine." One of the villagers crossed himself, his voice shaking. "The spirits, they must have claimed them." Another villager, an old man who had once been a servant in the Tham mansion, nodded gravely. This place was never meant for the living. They disturbed it. And this is what happens when you disturb the dead. The group stood in stunned silence, their lanterns flickering weakly in the damp, cold air. The oppressive atmosphere of the mansion pressed down on them, as though the very walls were alive with malevolent intent. No one dared move closer to the bodies, not wanting to risk whatever dark force had claimed the thieves. It was Master Dan who finally broke the silence, his voice low and filled with dread. "We must leave this place, now." They turned and hurried back up the stairs, not daring to look back at the twisted, lifeless forms of Tayo and Bulk. The mansion seemed to groan as they left, the sound of creaking wood and distant whispers following them out into the cold morning air. The villagers didn't stop until they were far from the estate, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they finally reached the safety of the village below. That evening the village held a quiet, solemn gathering. No one spoke much, but the fear in their eyes said everything. The Tham mansion was no longer just a place of dark stories and whispered warnings. It was something far worse now, a place where the dead ruled, and the living had no place. Teo and Bok's bodies were left where they had fallen, no one daring to return for them. The mansion, once a symbol of greed and power, had become a tomb. And so, the legend of the Tham estate grew, spreading beyond the village, carried by the wind like a dark omen. Travelers who passed through the village heard the warnings and avoided the path that led up the hill. No one dared venture near the mansion again, for it was said that those who entered its cursed halls would never return. The village fell into an uneasy quiet in the days that followed. But at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the land, the villagers swore they could still hear the faint sounds of laughter, cold, echoing laughter and the whispered voices of the spirits, forever haunting the mansion that had become their prison. The Tham mansion stood as it always had, a dark silhouette on the horizon, its windows dark and empty. But the villagers knew better. They knew that the mansion was not empty. It never had been. The dead had claimed it long ago, and they were never letting go.